an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, chapters 11, 12, and 13. Inej, Kaz, and Nina. In these chapters, Inej finally kind of confronts Kaz about whether or not he would have come to get her even if her legs were broken. It's a conversation that doesn't go the way I want it to go, but it's probably gone about as well as it's gonna go. Also, Nina walks right into what I think is a trap, but I'm not sure what's happening here. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Joanna for commissioning this episode. I am excited to be continuing with the story. This section, we start off in part 3, titled Brick by Brick. And yeah, there's a lot of little moments that I really, really liked in these chapters. There's a lot of character stuff, which I think is this writer's strong suit in a lot of ways. I feel like she's really cracked that code about how getting a crew of people together for a heist is like a really nice shortcut for having a bunch of people of different strengths and abilities, which lends itself to wildly different types of personalities and characters. And the fact that she just keeps on coming up with new heists, like one after another, and it never actually feels repetitive. It's not like you're rolling your eyes like, oh, another heist at all. You're like, sweet, a heist again. I love it. I'm just kind of impressed with how long she has been able to sustain this and sustain my interest with allegedly a kind of repeating pattern. It's not a weakness at all. So anyway, all right. Chapter 11. Kaz and Inej are alone together. They completely miss the whole thing with these weird winged folks that swoop down and try and steal Grisha away. When we talk to our friends later, and they're explaining to Kaz and Inej what happened, I think it's Nina who says, I'm pretty sure that they weren't Grisha. And that honestly had never even occurred to me. I assumed they were Grisha that had been experimented on in the way that the Driscoll had those rooms in their prisons. But what everyone seems to be theorizing is that these are regular people who have been tailored by Grisha who are using Parem, namely fabricators, more than likely. Fabricators, maybe heart renders in combo, they can kind of work together. Nina says that a lot of heart renders could be fabricators, and we find out we see in her activity, since having used the Parem, that there is some truth to that showing in Nina's abilities already. But we'll get to that. So they have gotten away before this whole winged kidnapper thing goes down. And Inej is reflecting on what a labyrinth the city of Ketterdam is. There are so many back alleys. There are so many neighborhoods that have a certain vibe or purpose, and how she had to parse all of that out for herself. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm choking. Excuse me. And this is all after she was freed from the menagerie. So to top off the overwhelm that comes with, like, I don't know how many of you have moved to a new place where you really don't know anything about the area. Nowadays, it's a lot easier because we all have phones and we can instantly pull up maps, and we can, we don't have to talk to locals to find out things. We can just look them up and check reviews, and Facebook will, automatically pull our location and tell us what's nearby. Like, it's a whole different scene now. But as somebody who moved to new cities before cell phones were what they are, it is a really intense experience. Intense is the best word I can think of, because it's not necessarily bad, but oftentimes it's not exactly outright good either. It taxes your focus because you need to, like, kind of try and remember how to get back to where you were going, but you can't leave like a trail of breadcrumbs or anything. And remembering how to get back to where you were going is only part of it, because you also want to remember how you got to wherever you wind up, because you're trying to get somewhere allegedly that you might need to go to again. And meanwhile, you're figuring out what the rules are for walking here. Depending on the types of cities that you have visited, y'all know what I'm talking about, that there is a culture to every city, and there are certain things that are just accepted even though they're technically against the rules. Like, for example, in New York, walking against the cross light. Obviously, people do that all the fucking time. Is it considered rude? A little, especially if there's somebody who is about to clearly pull through a light and you just go out in front of them. But it is done so frequently that nobody cares. In Philadelphia, people don't really do that the same way. They are much more concerned about, because the city is smaller and opportunities to, like, the streets aren't as close together, so you aren't held up by constant stops if you obey the rules the way that you would be in New York. There's just a lot of, like, little things like that, and areas that you can, like, cut through that you might not know you can cut through there, that's allowed the first time that you go through, or a spot that you cut through that you thought was fine and you find out later was private property. All kinds of things like that. So I actually, like, really related to this section of her trying to figure out exactly what this city is like, and how she is also, on top of being overwhelmed from that, she is also instilled with this paranoia that Tante Helene is going to, like, come and take her and drag her back to the menagerie that she was just released from. She knows that that technically is not supposed to happen because of the deal that Kaz made, but it's not like Tante Helene is so well known for her upright attitude. You know what I mean? She is what she is, isn't she? So honestly, the paranoia that Inej feels, I think, is totally justified. And she thinks to herself about how she really needs to prove that she is useful to the dregs so that they would let her earn her way out of the new contract as well. So what this really comes down to is how often Inej has been worried and preoccupied about how useful she can be to the dregs, or to whoever happens to hold her contract at the time, because she's trying to get to the other side. And that really dovetails with what this chapter deals with, which is, well, this chapter and the next one, which is Kaz's perspective, which is her asking him if Van Eck had succeeded in breaking her legs, would Kaz have come to get her? Because she has this deep doubt that she cannot shake, that Kaz would actually risk himself and his crew if she were not able to do the things for him that she is. And it's an interesting thing because I have mentioned before that I'm frustrated with how Kaz has tried to share with her a couple times how he feels about her. And it seemed like she heard and understood him. But then she has these kinds of doubts that to me are... It's self-evident that of course he would still come to get you. You know how he feels about you. He told you. But I keep forgetting how much her life has revolved around being useful. And that, like, pattern sort of internalizing that your worth is directly tied to your productivity is also something that I can deeply fucking relate to. And that is not some shit that you can unlearn easily. It is, I mean, on a smaller scale, obviously, this is a very different situation. But recently, with getting sick, I apologized to Owen for being sick and didn't realize how insane that is. Like, he had just gotten over being sick himself. And he was bummed that he wasn't able to do stuff, but it was not like... He was apologizing like, oh, I'm sorry we have to cancel this and that, or I'm sorry I don't want to do XYZ today, I'm so tired. But I was like feeling guilty for being sicker than he was, and I acted like I was just being a bigger baby about it than him. And it wasn't until Owen was like, babe, you're just way sicker than I was. It's okay. Honestly, having come out of a relationship where I felt like my partner constantly resented me not doing enough, I am still not used to somebody who doesn't hold it against me when I need to take a break and rest. I'm still not used to somebody who doesn't see me, like, quote, bringing something to the relationship in a material way as the ultimate goal. And so, you know, I'm really kind of being hard on Inej when I say that, like, bitch, you fucking know, stop it. What are you worried about? But the truth is, you don't unlearn patterns like that overnight. And somebody needs to tell you, it's okay. I don't think that way about you, or, you know, whatever. They need to do and say that kind of thing multiple times for years before you ever start to really, really believe it. So the conversation that she winds up having with Kaz, where he like assures her, he has to struggle with himself because he wants to just tell her what she means to him in a very real way and be honest about it. And at the same time, he recognizes that that will make him vulnerable in a way that nobody on his crew can afford right now, and could potentially make Inej vulnerable as well. So he has to try and assure her, without a doubt, while keeping the way he feels about her out of the conversation, which is a really, really tricky thing to do, and still get her to believe him. But it seems like he succeeds, I think. So, you know, I'll be very interested to see how this develops, because I won't say I ship these two. I don't really want them together. I don't think they're probably really very good for each other, like, emotionally. Especially, he doesn't believe in anything she believes in because she's pretty religious, and he can't ever help. He just seems unable to resist making some sort of comment about how the gods are not real and, you know, whatever, every time she mentions them. Little things like that will wear on a relationship, I feel like. It's not like you can't be partners with somebody who believes something different than you. But when it's as deep a part of you as it is with Inej, I just don't know that that's something that you can, like, get past. But I do want the two of them to be able to come to terms with it, because they clearly haven't done that yet. So she and Kaz are fleeing here. And there's this moment that I really liked. Inej still remembered the jolt she'd felt when she saw the words "rare spices" painted on the side of one of the warehouses. It was an advertisement, the words framed by two Suli girls, rendered in paint, brown limbs bare, the embroidery of their scant silks hinted at by golden brushstrokes. Inej had stood there, gaze fastened to the sign, less than 2 miles from where the rights to her body had been bought and sold and haggled over, her heart jackrabbiting in her chest, panic seizing her muscles, unable to stop staring at those girls, the bangles on their wrists, the bells around their ankles. Eventually, she'd willed herself to move, and as if some spell had been broken, she'd run faster than she ever had, back to the slat, racing over the rooftops, the city passing in gray glimpses below her reckless feet. That night she'd dreamed the painted girls had come to life. They were trapped in the brick wall of the warehouse, screaming to be set free. But Inej was powerless to help them. Rare spices. The sign was still there, faded from the sun. It still held power for her, made her muscles clench, her breath hitch. But maybe when she had her ship, when she'd brought down the first slaver, the paint would blister from the bricks. The cries of those girls in their mint-colored silks would turn to laughter. They would dance for no one but themselves. She imagined her saints wrapping ropes around the column topped by Gezen's head and pulling it to the ground. So I love this because I often forget, being somebody who is part of very few marginalized groups, I often forget what it must be like to be somebody from a group that is stereotyped or exoticized and objectified, and have that be such a matter of fact and part of the fabric of society that advertisements like this, you just come face to face with them out in the wild. Some like really creepy fetishization. Ooh, I don't know how to say that word. But I really love this juxtaposed with the fact that it's so close to where she was bought and sold. Like, of course this would affect her this way. It's just something that I personally don't really relate to very much. The closest thing that I have run into are the kinds of like, you know, ugly slurs or like uses of photos of people who are fat. And especially when there's somebody who's like got a fat body and their head's been cut off so that you can't identify them. And it's just the focus is on their body and their weight. And that weight seems pretty close to my weight. And they're being used as a quote before picture or as a warning picture or something like that. That's the closest that I can come. And it's not the same because it's not really like, it's just not the same. And I just found this compelling because we don't often see Inej really being vulnerable in a way that she can't control. Like, she's often, we are in her head and see moments of her weaknesses and her being afraid, but she clamps it down and manages to present a pretty like controlled front to people. And this is a description of her basically having a panic attack and having to run away. And I feel like that's a really nice depiction of both the trauma of what she endured and the ongoing process of having to face society, knowing that they're going to see you like that, even if you are, you know, free and master of yourself. So I just really liked that moment. So where they go, they wind up going to this like abandoned like linen storage shed manufacturing area. There was a fire and it has been left abandoned for a little while. And Kaz has it set up as a safe house with water and some crackers and nuts and stuff. And he asks her if Van Eck hurt her. And she says no, because technically, physically, he didn't. But it's really clear when she says it that she's like not telling him the whole story. And he doesn't press the issue, but he clearly notices that she's keeping something to herself. And he just decides to drop it. But later on, this gets brought back up again. And she's left alone for a little while so that she can rest because she has just been through it. And as we find out later, Kaz has another fucking mission for them. So she needs to get her strength back as quickly as possible. So they head back to Black Veil Island, which is the island with all the mausoleums that nobody goes to, that they've been like using as their headquarters. And she's really worried that maybe not everybody made it out and is going to be able to meet them. But then everybody is there and she's so happy. And I have to say, I am loving her relationship with Nina. I know I've said it before, but there's something about the way that my brain works that I keep forgetting how much they liked each other until I read it on the page. And then I'm like, oh yeah, they have grown really close to the point where Inej winds up putting herself on the line for Nina's sake, because Nina wants to collect Grisha and help them escape so that they aren't going to be subject to this fucking weird ass abduction thing that's going on. And I just love that, like, Nina flies at her and like grabs her and hugs her. Later on, Inej like puts her head on Nina's shoulder, which is a really like, again, a vulnerable gesture and really trusting that I just don't expect from Inej ever. I think of her as being incredibly reserved all the time. And I like to see that she isn't that way with everybody. She is often, but I really love that she has an outlet for that with Nina. And, cause Nina, you know, as much as I love her being like close with Inej, Nina is like me, where she's like an oversharer and very demonstrative and charming. And she, like, her being nice to you or talking to you is not necessarily a signal of her being vulnerable. And so it's a little harder to quantify with her. Inej, this kind of gesture, I think, is a very obvious thing that I can point to, you know? So then they talk about the abduction thing. There were two Shu with wings and a man and a woman who were not normal. Nina's power had no effect on them, said Wylan. Nina said non-committally. I'm interested in that, because it sounds like she almost doesn't agree that it had no effect, but she doesn't feel confident enough to say what she's thinking. And they like are theorizing about exactly what this is. Kaz asks, were they using Parem? And she says, no, I don't think they were Grisha. They didn't display any powers and they weren't healing their wounds. It looked like they had some kind of metal plating beneath their skin. Kuei groaned. Kergud. They all looked at him blankly. He sighed and said, when my father made Parem, the government tests it on fabricators. When your dear Shu friends test Parem, why did your dear Shu friends test Parem on fabricators? They have more fabricators in captivity, said Kuei. They're the easiest to capture, Matthias put in, ignoring Nina's sour look. Until recently, they received little combat training, and without Parem, their powers are poorly suited to battle. Our leaders want to conduct more experiments, Kuei continued, but they don't know how many Grisha they can find. Maybe if they hadn't killed so many, Nina suggested. Kuei nodded, missing or ignoring the sarcasm in Nina's voice. Yes. Well, Kuei. They have few Grisha, and using Parem shortens a Grisha's life, so they bring doctors to work with the fabricators already sick from Parem. They plan to make a new kind of soldier, the Kergud. I don't know if they succeeded. I think I can answer that question with a big fat yes, said Jesper. And Nina says, before the war, I heard they tried something similar in Ravka, reinforcing skeletons, tampering with bone density, metal implants. And Jesper says, oh, that's right, it's not Heartriders, it's Corporalki. Metal glass textiles. This seems like Corporalki work. Tailors blur the line between fabricator and Corporalnik. I had a teacher in Ravka who could have been either a heartrender or a fabricator if she wanted to. Instead, she became a great tailor. So corporalniks and heartrenders are the same things, I guess. That's interesting, because corporal is like its body. So heartrender, I guess, is just like a kind of a, what's the word I want? Slang, maybe even. So Inej is like, so did they graft them onto his back? Like, how, what do you mean? And Nina says, no, they were mechanical. But it is more sophisticated than just slapping a pair of wings between someone's shoulder blades. You'd have to link the musculature, hollow out the bones to decrease body weight, then somehow compensate for the loss of bone marrow, maybe replace the skeleton entirely. The level of complexity. And it's a really frightening prospect, to be honest, that they are abducting Grisha, forcing them to take a drug that will kill them in order to access a level of power that will allow for them to create these sort of super soldiers. And so they're using the super soldiers to try and locate other Grisha. The fact that Nina has already taken Parem and so is still addicted, because we have her POV later in which she wakes up thinking about how to get the drug and has to like calm herself down again, and is apparently having to do this every day now. And the fact that she was able to do the sort of tailoring on Wylan that she was, it really feels like she's a prime target for this kind of work if they find out what she's been able to do and how much she really wants to take more Parem. I am concerned, just saying. So they talk about then this other thing that I thought was really interesting. Kaz, I think that it's Matthias, says something about how he doubts that the council will react to the Shu attacking. He says the Shu were not wearing like Shu colors and flags, and like this wasn't an official attack, and they're probably just not going to take responsibility for it and say it was an outlying group. And I think Nina says so they just get away with it, and Cass says I don't think so. The two Shu warships that they used to get here, the Council of Tides dry docked them. Jesper's boots slid off the table and hit the floor with a thud. What? They pulled back the tide, all of it, used the sea to carve a new island with both of those warships beached on it. You can see them lying on their sides, sails dragging in the mud right there in the harbor. A show of force, said Matthias. On behalf of Grisha or the city? Jesper asked. Kaz shrugs. Who knows, but it might make Shu a little bit more careful about hunting on Ketterdam streets. So, the Council of Tides, like, at this point, Wylan asks if they would help. And we find out that the Council of Tides is, like, completely unknown. Nobody knows who they are. They never see them, like, coming and going. And it's a really interesting little, like, new thing to add to the mix, that there's this other power out there that also contains, it's all Grisha, that is resisting the Shu coming in and trying to steal people, and is really able to organize in a way that I don't feel like we've seen other than in stories. We haven't seen it firsthand. We've seen, like, from Nina's perspective with her talking about being part of the army and resistance and whatnot. But that has been mostly, you know, either, I was about to say in flashbacks, but not even really in flashbacks. When we flash back to Nina, it's her already being imprisoned or captured. And so we never actually see that. And I suppose that's what the other books that came before these were about, the Grisha trilogy. So let's see. Okay, yeah, here it is. A Grisha addicted to Parem can't survive for long, so the shoe found another way to exploit their powers. And when Jesper says, I swear to God, one of them could tell where we were by our smell, Inej is like, wait, what the fuck? Could they do that? And Nina's like, I think it's possible. It sure fucking looked that way. So this is just bringing a whole new slew of problems into the mix. And at this point, Kaz starts to talk about the new job. And it's a really amazing little... I love it because it is so simple, but also feels very outside of Kaz's wheelhouse. So I don't feel like people are going to see this coming at all. He asks if any of them have wondered what he did with all the cash that Pekka Rollins gave them. And I had, actually. I mentioned that earlier, but there have been so many huge preparations involved with a couple of heists they've done so far. I just assumed that all their money went to that, but it turns out it didn't. Where do you think the money went? Guns? Asked Jesper. Ships? Queried Inej. Bombs? Suggested Wylan. Political bribes? Offered Nina. I love how in character all of those responses are. And Kaz says, sugar. And it turns out what he has done is he has planned okay, first of all, he bought each of them shares in sugar, in sugar, in private accounts under aliases for all of them. And he bought a bunch of shares under Van Eck's name. Now, not his name directly, because it's way too obvious and it wouldn't fool anybody. He bought shares under a name that will lead to Van Eck's wife, that will lead to figuring out that it's Van Eck's. And what he plans to do is get Wylan to use this bug that a weevil, I think is what he calls it. And Jesper keeps calling it a wyvel since Wylan created it, which will initially look like a natural disaster kind of thing. Like there was just something got into the system and ate and ruined a bunch of the sugar. However, once they follow who wound up profiting over this huge loss, and they discover that Van Eck is profiting off it, they will take a closer look and be able to recognize it as deliberate sabotage. So essentially, what Kaz is doing here is ripping away Van Eck's reputation and his credibility so that when he starts to call on people for help, and including the Stodwatch, eventually he's going to get to a point where he isn't able to call upon anybody for anything anymore. And he could potentially go to prison, but like there's even the threat of him being executed over it. Destruction of property, tampering with the markets, it will be the end of him. He'll be charged with violating a contract and attempting to interfere with the market, said Kaz. There is no greater crime according to Kirch law. The sentences are the same as for murder. He could hang. Will he? Wylan said softly. I doubt he'll swing, said Kaz. My guess is they'll saddle him with a lesser charge. None of the Merchant Council will want to put one of their own on the gallows. As for whether or not he'll actually ever see the inside of a jail cell, he shrugged. Depends on how good his lawyer is. But he'll be barred from trade, said Wylan, his voice almost dazed. His holdings will be seized to make good on the lost sugar. It will be the end of the Van Eck Empire, Kaz said. What about Alice? asked Wylan. Again, Kaz shrugged. No one's going to believe that girl had anything to do with the financial scheme. Alice will sue for divorce and probably move back in with her parents. She'll cry for a week, sing for 2, and then get over it. Maybe she'll marry a prince. So, it's a pretty admirable plan, like honestly. The thing is, they need to get into the silos of sugar, and those shits are 20 stories high. And they have to get into the top, and there is a bananas set of locks that require 4 keys to open them. Well, that's okay. The locks are on the front, so that's why Inej is going to have to go up over the top. And I love, Nina says something about how, oh, really? You're going to do all of this without a net? And Inej is so insulted and is like, we don't need nets. Agatha never performs with a net. And to defend herself, Nina's like, yeah, and Agatha don't usually like perform 20 stories above cobblestones after being held prisoner for a week. At which point Kaz steps in and says, there will be a net. It's in place behind the silo guardhouse already, under a stack of sandbags. And Inej is blown away that he would do this. And there's not really a talk about this at this moment. But everybody stops talking and stares because Kaz taking that kind of precaution out of concern for somebody's life is just not something he does. It would be one thing if he were just ensuring that the plan went off and that somebody survived to the next step in the plan. But Inej is like, if she manages to even probably get into one of the silos, they might be all right. It's just the fact that this is apparently would like slow down the whole process. That is the thing that they are all kind of shocked by. The net is an extra bit of trouble and headache. And that he would be willing to do it is just so out of character for him. And it's something that he kind of chides himself for later because he realizes that he needs to fucking like get a hold of this worry that he feels about her. So they talk about exactly what it's going to take to beat Van Eck, and Kaz essentially says, the thing is that he has so much money and so much power that he can afford to take it slow and bide his time because he thinks we're nobodies and that we have no resources at our disposal. And he isn't completely wrong. We can get at him if we never stop moving, but we have to be absolutely relentless while he gets to fucking sit back and relax because we just aren't playing on the same footing as he is. And I like that conversation a lot. So then they talk about the deal that Nina makes, because Nina is essentially trying to get back to doing what she had used to do, which is protecting other Grisha. She is really concerned at the fact that there are Shu just swooping in, literally flying off with Grisha that they've taken prisoner, and basically sentencing them to death by giving them parem in order to get them to do various things. So she tells Kaz that she is not going to be part of this unless he agrees to find a way to get the few Grisha in the city out safely. She estimates that there are like 30, which is way less than I expected, to be honest. And Kaz just basically is like, no, we're absolutely not doing that. What are you even talking about? And she says, well, fine, then I'm out. And he's like, fine, then you're out. I really don't need you for this. And Inej says, but you need me. And I was like, oh shit. So Inej throws down to back up Nina and say, basically, if you don't help her, I'm not helping you. Because she knows what it means to be taken prisoner as a slave. She is aware, and she absolutely cannot stand for that. So finally, Kaz decides that he's going to help. But when we get into his perspective later, we find out that actually it suits him pretty well to do this, because he recognizes that if the Merchants Council winds up figuring out how they can take advantage of the Grisha in the city, they are going to be an even worse force to contend with, and that getting the Grisha out is probably going to make things easier for all of them in the end. So I kind of liked that reveal, because Kaz pretending to not want to go along with something when really it's what he desired all along is just really a lovely, like, in-character thing that doesn't really need to be there, but just makes such sense and reminds you how little you can trust what he says or how he acts in front of anybody. Now let's see. Oh, right. So they decide that the best way to get the Grisha out are to steal one of Van Eck's own ships, because those are the only ones that are probably not going to get checked. And what they would have to do is pretend with the captain of the ship that their orders come directly from Van Eck to get out all of these people, and that he will be rewarded with like a huge payout on the return trip. And that will be enough to cover for the fact that there are all of these additional people on a ship that aren't supposed to be. I think it sounds like a good idea, but it also sounds like something that could go wrong in about 40 different ways. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, I don't do heists. So, when they are talking about making sure that the captain believes, they need the seal, Van Eck's seal, in order to send a note. And Weiland is like, dude, I don't know what you think this is, but my dad has that seal in a safe that is like almost impossible to crack. And I love the fact that Weiland is like, there's not a way to break into that shit. Like, he has found the safe that will beat you. I'm sorry, but he just has. And Jesper suggests an explosion. And when Kaz is like, that might be a little bit much, Jesper rejoins with a very small explosion. And Weiland sort of stops and is like, actually, a very small explosion might be the exact thing. So I'll be very, very curious to see exactly how this works out. We could burn through the safe door in a matter of minutes without damaging the contents inside? Asked Nina. Hopefully. Hopefully, repeated Kaz. I've worked with worse. That's the spirit, Kaz. So, then we go to Kaz's POV. He is really game to, like, rescue the Grisha, not for that sake, as I said, but because of the potential for them to be weapons down the road, but also is concerned about it slowing everything down. At last, they put their lists and sketches aside. The wreckage of their makeshift meal was cleared from the table to avoid attracting the rats of Black Veil, and the lanterns were doused. The others would sleep. Kaz could not. He'd meant what he'd said. Van Eck had more money, more allies, and the might of the city behind him. They couldn't just be smarter than Van Eck. They had to be relentless. And Kaz could see what the others couldn't. They'd won the battle today, but the Merch was still winning the war. That Van Eck was willing to risk involving the Stod Watch, and by extension the Merchant Council, meant he really believed he was invulnerable. So it goes on in this vein with him just thinking about exactly what is at stake, the fact that he had to work with Pekka Rollins, the whole fact that Kaz has to set aside so much of his overall goal in order to deal with this right now. And he would have to show the world what he already knew. Despite his soft hands and fine suits, Van Eck was a criminal, just as bad as any barrel thug. Worse, because his word... Just as bad as any barrel thug. Worse, because his word was worth nothing. I really like that especially. Like, even a barrel thug, we do rely on, like, oral agreements and honor to a degree. And he doesn't even fucking do that. Which, why would you, when you have all of the fucking resources? So here comes Inej asking him why the net. And he says, I just went to a lot of trouble to get my spider back. I didn't do it so you could crack your skull open the next day. But he thinks to himself, yes, why the net? Why something that would complicate the assault he'd planned on the silos and leave them twice as open to exposure? So I love this. He's saying this one thing. He's trying to keep it under wraps. She says, oh, you protect your investments, which is exactly what she had thought to herself before about getting her legs broken. And she sits on this for a little while with their conversation until she finally tells him, so I know that you asked me if he'd hurt me before. And he hadn't, but he threatened to break my legs, and he wanted it to be an uneven break. And I love how much Kaz has to sort of fight down the absolute screaming rage that comes to the surface, because he knows that this guy figured out exactly the thing that would get to Inej and fuck her up mentally. Like, this is something, being helpless and at the mercy of somebody else is something that Kaz fought to get her out of, and she wound up right there again, and the guy threatened to cripple her, you know, like, this is just the worst. And the fact that she confides this with him, she's just straight up like, would you have come and got me anyway? And he has to be so careful about how he answers. You know, I really wish that they could be more honest with each other, but I also really understand how much is riding on whether or not they can all keep their focus. And nothing messes up your focus like giving a shit about somebody in a romantic way. So there's a kind of a fun moment where she's going on recon to check out the Van X place, and he comes climbing up with her, but she tries to tell him before he does that he doesn't have to come. And when they get to the top, she just bails and is like, oh, I'm going to do the rest of this myself. And he's so irritated because he had to do this like climb and his leg is hurting him, and he's a little bit afraid of heights, I think. So there's like this whole bit with him really pushing himself to get up there because he thinks they're going to do this together. And then her being like, oh, no, you're not part of this. Bye. And he's like, what the fuck? You made me come up here? And she's like, I didn't make you. I told you didn't need to, but you just had to let your pride get in the way and force you up here. So I loved that as well. Just little moments like that of the two of them, like sort of needling each other. And she comes back out and she says, he's had Schuler locks installed on all the house's exterior windows. Kaz let out an annoyed breath. Is that a problem? She asked. No, a Schuler lock won't stop any pick worth of stones, but they're time consuming. I couldn't make sense of them, so I had to wait for one of the kitchen staff to open the back door. And I like, too, that he thinks about how he should be teaching her how to pick locks a little bit better. Just every time that there's anything that could have endangered her in any way, he's like, fuck, I gotta do something about that. You know what, Kaz? You need to get your head right, buddy. Stop it. Stop thinking about this. This was when they were at their best, with nothing but the job between them, working together, free of complications. He should leave it at that, but he needed to know. So this is when he asks her, and finally she tells him. And Kaz was going to have to find a new language of suffering to teach that smug merch son of a bitch. So yeah, it's just, he says, I'm going to open Van Eck up. I'm going to give him a wound that can't be sewn shut, that he'll never recover from. The kind that can't be healed. The kind you endured? Yes. It was a promise. It was an admission. I loved this whole conversation. I loved it so much. Would you come? Dirty Hands would not. The boy who could get them through this, get them their money, keep them alive, would do her the courtesy of putting her out of her misery, then cut his losses and move on. I would come for you, he said, and when he saw the wary look she shot him, he said it again. I would come for you, And if I couldn't walk, I'd crawl to you. And no matter how broken we were, we'd fight our way out together, knives drawn, pistols blazing, because that's what we do. We never stop fighting. At last she nodded, the smallest dip of her chin. They returned to the tomb in silence. So, I like that a lot. Let's go to Nina, who is still struggling with recovering from this addiction. I really don't know if this ever goes away. Like, she may wake up thinking about this drug every day for the rest of her life, which is bleak as fuck. Matthias, meanwhile, is already up, and they're concocting a plan to go journey to this like area that she knows, this bar or inn or something, where messages can be sent amongst other Grisha. And she's going to put the word out that they're going to try and give everybody a way out of Ketterdam. And let's see. Zoya used to say that fear is a phoenix. You can watch it burn 1,000 times, and still it will return. The need for Perem felt that way too. And I like that line a lot, because there really is a part of me that has always sort of thought that I would get to a point where certain things wouldn't bother me anymore, or I wouldn't be susceptible to the same behaviors or temptations or habits. And you just have to learn to do better and be better every single day and do it all over again the next day. There is never a point where you just get past something altogether. You may learn to deal with it much more easily so that it's almost an afterthought if you get good enough at it. But it's still something that you have to cope with. It's never done and over. And that is something that I absolutely still have not learned. So I really, really like that line. It turns out that she and Matthias are going to be listed as brother and sister, and they're both wearing these like really awful outfits that for some reason Matthias loves on her. Like, it's just such a frumpy dress, but he is delighted. I love it so much. He looked like someone had just given him a tuba full of puppies. You could be a maiden on the first day of Röngsgel. What's Röngsgel? asked Kue. Some festival, I can't remember. And I love the fact that he is so into this when it's so repulsive and terrible and frumpy and like dowdy to her. Everybody else reacts the same way. Like, they all clearly have the same opinion that Nina does. But for whatever reason, this is really doing it for Matthias, which I just find so funny. Like, I'm not going to dwell on this because I only have 8 minutes left, but I just loved this moment because it's so weird. And I wish that I could see the dress and see into his head at the memories that this clearly conjured for him and what it is like. There's just obviously some real nostalgia there, and I am very curious about it. So they head up and they are going into, let's see, homesick as she was, Nina, some small shameful thing inside her, cringed at how old-fashioned everything looked. Even the people, clinging to traditional Ravkan dress, looked like relics of another time. Had the years she'd spent in Ketterdam done this to her? Somehow changed the way she saw her own people and customs? She didn't want to believe that. I love this. Have you guys experienced that? There is nothing quite as jarring as realizing that your perspective on something has changed so completely. And this can be a positive or a negative thing. Sometimes it's just, wow, I remember I reacted to this one way, and now I'm woke and realize how problematic it was. But unfortunately, it can also go the other way, where you're like, wow, I'm being way more judgmental about this thing than is really warranted or than I was before. What's going on with this? Like, and that's just a part of like growing. And I just love that we get peeks at things like this in these characters' minds, because it just shows what a journey they've all been on, you know? So she has to instruct Matthias on how to not look quite so fucking intimidating, because he walks around with this glower on his face all the time, and asks him to try and be like more friendly and just welcoming looking in his expression, which he overdoes a little bit and like says little friend to an old woman who's like putting out laundry, I think. Let's see. I'm trying to see where the moment is. The next stall. Oh no, it's a marketplace. That's right. And this woman says, "Always had a taste for Fjördens. Ask him if he wants to play princess and barbarian," she said with a cackle. And Nina tries to be like, "Oh, she just said you're a nice fellow and a credit to the Fjerden race." And he's like, "No, that doesn't sound right, because she used this word babink, and you've called me babink before. What does that word mean?" And she tries to like put him off. And finally, when she says barbarian, he's like really offended. But then she explains this story. And it turns out that it's like a 3-book series. I love this so much. Where he kidnaps a Ravkan princess. That would never happen. In the story, it does. And they spend a long time getting to know each other in his cave. He lives in a cave. It's a very nice cave. Fur, jeweled mugs, mead. "Ah," he said approvingly, "a treasure hoard, like Angzar the Mighty. They become allies then?" And she tries again to put him off. And finally, he's very brooding. But he falls in love with the Ravkan princess, and that allows her to civilize him. To civilize him? Yes, but that's not until the 3rd book. This culture is disgusting. The idea that a Ravkan could civilize a Fjerden. Perhaps I'll write a story about insatiable Ravkans who like to get drunk and take their clothes off and make unseemly advances towards hapless Fjerdens. I love this so much, because this is another look at the way that peoples are, like, from other cultures and countries, are treated like they are basically not quite up to human standards. They're like almost people, but not quite. And I love how indignant he gets over this whole thing. And they continue going back and forth in this fashion until they get to this place where a guy asks, "Can I help you?" And they continue this code that establishes that they are going to be meeting with somebody who is Grisha. They sit down. The tavern door slammed shut behind them. Immediately, the other customers shoved away from their tables, chairs clattering to the floor, guns pointed at Nina and Matthias. Without pausing to think, Nina and Matthias leapt to their feet and positioned themselves back to back, ready to fight, Matthias with a pistol and Nina with her hands up. From the back of the tavern, a hooded girl emerged, her collar drawn up to cover most of her face. "Come quietly, there's no need for a fight." This girl starts to drop Nina's pulse so that she passes out, but Nina stops and she reaches out for something. And she feels a weird awareness, described as a pocket of cold in a deep lake, a bracing shock. It was familiar. She'd felt something similar when she'd brought down the guard the night they'd kidnapped Alice, but this was much stronger. She yanks inward with this motion that pulls all of these bone fragments, the relics from like saints, supposedly, in through the windows. And it makes it seem like they've got this whole crew of people outside who are attacking them. So one of the guys is yelling about how they have reinforcements. And I love that this gives this illusion, and she totally did not intend for that to happen. And all of a sudden, when they are in the midst of like beginning to open fire, all of a sudden, she and Matthias are yanked up into the air. And so are all of the men who have attacked them. So it's not just, the two of them being like stopped. Everybody in this room is brought to a halt. and a woman enters, and it turns out that it is Zoya, whom Nina was just quoting in a previous chapter, and who has been in charge of a great deal of this revolution. And I am dying to know what this trap is, because I guess maybe they could have recognized that Matthias is a Fjerdan, and that maybe think that he's like coerced her into this to try and catch Grisha. I don't know. I mean, that woman on the street knew that he was Fjerdan the instant she looked at him. So I feel like that has to be it, right? But I don't know. I'm hoping that it's not like that Zoya is like turned traitor or thinks that Nina has turned traitor, but it seems like she thinks that because of the way she says, "You've made a new friend." So I guess we'll find out. But it definitely caught me by surprise. I didn't think there was going to be a trap here. So yikes. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. But again, thank you so much to Joanna for this. I'm really loving being able to consistently read through this one because it's been very good. And I feel like I've gotten to know these characters so much better. And I hope that you guys are all enjoying the coverage. And I will be seeing you again soon. There's another episode scheduled for, I believe, next week with a new episode. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.